Hello, everybody. I'm so glad for you all to be here with us. I am Rhonda Mahalik. I'm the Director of Marketing at Junior Library Guild, and we are very excited to welcome you today because this is our first webcast of 2021. So we're glad you're here, and we're especially glad that our special guest is here, Tate, who we'll introduce in just a second. And we're excited to be with you celebrating our preparations really for Black History Month next month. So we wanted to be able to bring this fascinating author, illustrator to you, but also help you get some ideas about your lesson plans and give you a pre-recorded webcast that you can share with your students. So I'm excited to get this ball rolling. Before I do that, I want to just do a little housekeeping. Wanted to let you all know that this is being recorded like we do with all of our webcasts. So if someone you know wasn't able to join us or you have to hop off, you'll be able to watch the on-demand recording probably within a few hours of the live session ending, and you can access it at this very same link. We will be taking questions, and so if you have anything you'd like to talk to Dawn about, or you'd like to share about your thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. So please just use the Q&A box, and if you'll find that either already live on your screen, or you can click on the little icon at the bottom and it'll pop it up. If you are hearing any background music right now, refresh your screen and that ought to turn it off. That seems to be a running problem these days. And I also want to very quickly talk to you about some of the resources we have, because I don't want you to miss them when the webcast gets going. So I'm going to do that really quick. We have, first and foremost, an opportunity for one of you live viewers to win an autographed collection of 3 of Tate's books that have been selected for JLG. So we would love for you to enter that to win, and we'll be picking a winner after the webcast and probably let you know in the next couple of days. Our goal is for you to get those books as well in time for what you have planned for Black History Month. We also have some awesome teacher's guides and Q&As and other types of videos that Don and his team have graciously shared with us. So you can download those to go along with some of the books we're talking about today and other books that he has under his belt. So please do. And then I also wanted to let you know, if you're a member of JLG, we have a Black History Month sale going on right now, and we have discounted a good selection of books. New books down to $8 a piece. And there's a link there on the resources if you'd like to go see what we've got. And again, so that you can help prepare your shelves and your displays and get ready for that. And there's some other things there too that we'd love for you to think about. We're hosting online book fairs now, and we've got some great options right now for digital and digital plus print reading bundles going on. So just a little heads up about that. But let's get to the real meat of this. I want to introduce my colleague, Drew Scott, who's going to take the reins from here and introduce you guys to Dawn and get this party started. So Drew, take it away.
Wonderful.
From here. You can turn your phone on now and get going.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rhonda. I'm just so excited to be able to talk with Don and interview him, and I'll be handling and taking some of the questions and read them off so we can get those answered. So as they come up, I'll have various points throughout this next hour where we're answering some of those questions. So I'll try to get to as many as possible. But especially with everything going on and everything that's coming up, I was just really excited to be a part of this webcast and participate and having the opportunity to talk with Don and hear some of his insights and some of the work that he's been doing and his background and everything like that. So I'm just excited to dive in and be a part of this just like everyone else. So without too much more, Don, love to hear just a little bit from you, a little bit of your background, and have you get after it.
Well, thank you, Junior Library Guild. It's such an honor to be here today. I appreciate the support. When you support diverse voices, you make it so much easier for me to get my hands into the books of my intended audience. And Junior Library Guild has always supported me. So you're doing the important work. Thank you. So yeah, I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. Yeah, there are Black people in Iowa, believe it or not. And I was the kind of kid who liked to draw and make things. I was always busy building or braiding or macrameing, or, you know, I loved like Lincoln logs. Remember Lincoln logs, okay? And And as recently I started working on a graphic memoir, so I was interviewing my mom. And one of the things that I forgot about was not only was I the kind of kid who liked to draw, but I was constantly making things. I was a craft kid. And I remember one of my favorite books was called Fun with Next to Nothing. So I was constantly making like toys, puppets, anything from things that I could find from around the house. I continued to create things through elementary school and middle school. And I was always the art kid in class, but for whatever reason, I could never get my art teacher's attention. I just really wanted to let them know that I loved art and I was good at art and I wanted them to notice my art, but it seemed like they were always more interested in the artwork of my white classmates. But that's okay, because I think that may have been the thing that just sort of gave me that extra oomph to continue to do what I really wanted to do, which was to create art. I was inspired, believe it or not, to go into the commercial arts by the television show Good Times. Okay, you remember JJ, who was always in the background of that television show, painting and drawing pictures. Well, JJ later on went on to become a graphic artist at an advertising agency. So then that's about when I was in maybe, middle school or high school. And I started to research commercial art. And I decided that that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to work for an advertising agency. I was also inspired to become a book creator by my aunt, Eleanor E. Tate, who was one of the first African Americans to get hired at the Des Moines Register as a journalist. And then later on, she started writing young adult novels. And one of her novels, Just an Overnight Guest, was adapted into a movie, and it debuted at the Des Moines Public Library. And I was there that night, and my aunt spoke about her work, and she inspired me that night to become a book creator myself. I wanted to tell important stories just like she did, but I didn't see myself as an author at the time. I knew that I would tell stories with pictures. Out of college, I took a job at the Perfection Learning Corporation as a publication designer. And in addition to, designing these Basel books and classroom aids and teacher's guides, I would travel to various reading conferences like, the International Reading Association and Texas Library Association. And that's where I met teachers and librarians and other authors and illustrators on the trade side. And I knew that that's where I wanted to take my career long term. I loved the idea that I could use my artwork, that thing that I like to do, to encourage literacy with young people. My first book as an illustrator published in 2000, it was called Say Hey, A Song of Willie Mays, and I got a chance to work with my dream editor, Andrea Pinckney. Since then, it's been about one book per year. I moved to Austin in '89, I believe, and I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And my friends would encourage me to to write a book. Don, when are you going to write a book? You know all about how to get a book published. But, at that time, I was really shy about, writing a story. I thought that writing was for people who were much smarter than me. Writing was for people who had, larger degrees than I did. I thought they would make fun of my voice. When I speak, I use my mom's voice, my mom's colloquial voice, and the little things that my mom says in the home that is not said anyplace else. So I became ashamed of the way that I spoke. But as I started to study about writing, I discovered that my imperfect, non-Queen's English speaking voice is the personality that I leave on the page. And so I wrote and I wrote every day. And my very first book that published as an author was called It Just Happened When Bill Traylor Started to Draw, published with the Lee and Low in 2012. It won the Ezra Jack Keats New Writers Honor Award, and that gave me the confidence to continue to write and to illustrate my stories. So that's kind of my journey.
Thank you so much. That is fantastic. And that was, one of the questions I was going to get to, where did that passion come from and all that. So just to hear the upbringing and hear everything that you've done, and that journey is really powerful, Don. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So I've got to spend a little bit of time with your books and very specifically the history the books that you write about history, the books that you write about things that have happened in the past and how important it is to remember those things. And you do it so well through picture books. And I would love to hear just a little bit, why are picture books, why is that medium so powerful for explaining and talking about history with your audience?
Well, I believe that picture books are powerful tools for telling history. When I was in school, there weren't a lot of books that spoke to my history. And when the subject of Black history came up in school, it seemed like it was very journalistic, very boring. Once upon a time, so-and-so was born in 18 whatever, and, just didn't have that voice that really captured my attention. And it seemed like those books reduced my history to slavery. So for a while, I became embarrassed about the topic of slavery. And for a while, when I first got in publishing, it was kind of a subject that I wanted to avoid. And some folks will argue that there's way too many books on the topic of slavery. And I get that. But I would also disagree. I think that there just needs to be a better balance of books out there. We need more books that feature just boys doing fun things that boys like to do. We need more books featuring the young African-American girl who loves to skateboard. But we also need those Black history books. We need those stories where kids can see themselves and through history, where they can read about inspirational Black historical figures who changed the world, so that they can see those Black figures who are changing the world today, so that they can know that, even though you're 5 years old and 8 years old and 12 years old, you have the power within yourself, using the talents that you've been born with, to change the world. And I hope that my books serve as examples for kids to follow.
That's wonderful. Actually, I want to throw it over to a question. I thought there was a good one in here. So from Karen Lucas, how do you decide who to focus on in a biography? Where do you find the people whose lives you want to feature?
I get my ideas in many different places. The very first book that I wrote about was a story of Bill Traylor, who was an enslaved, at one time artist, an outsider artist. And it was my friend, author Diana Aston, who suggested that I write that story. And for a while, because I didn't see myself as a writer at that time, I kind of encouraged her, Diana, why don't you write the story and I'll illustrate it? But she just kept telling me, Don, this is not my story to tell, it's yours. It was my buddy, author Chris Barton, who suggested that I write about George Moses Horton. And again, it was the same sort of a thing where Chris, is an author. He could have written a wonderful story about George Moses Horton, but he was like, Don, this is your story to tell. I wrote a story about Eugene Sandow, who was a Victorian bodybuilder. And I wrote that story because many years ago, I participated in natural bodybuilding myself, and I lost. But I didn't give up. And I came back 2 years later and I won 2 trophies. And I wanted to put that joy and my love of the sport into a book somehow. But third graders don't bodybuild. So I wasn't quite sure if that was quite the book that I should tell. But my friends reminded me that when I'm writing a story like that, I'm telling the story of that kid who was born sick and weak and he wanted to get healthy. So I'm telling that inspirational story about the person. So I get my stories from many different people. The very last book that I sold, which hasn't been announced yet, I got the idea at the very last school visit where I visited in Chicago about this time last year. I presented to a group of 5th graders, and a 5th grade teacher came up to me afterwards and said, Don, you ought to write a story about this guy. And I kind of jotted down the note, and I got on the plane and I started doing my research, and I became so inspired. And then when the pandemic hit and my income was gone, what did I do? I sat down and I wrote that story. So I get my stories from so many different sources, but I just try to keep my ears open to the advice that I get from people around me.
Well, it sounds like you surround yourself with some good individuals. So getting inspiration from all over definitely helps, I'm sure, helps you with the voice that you have in your writing and expresses the experiences of the people that you write about, the individuals you write about. So kind of along those lines. So I see that you've done illustrations, you've authored titles, you've done both. So just talk a little bit about what you like about each one of those roles and what are some of the challenges that come along with them.
What I've learned since I started writing is that I love to write just as much as I love to illustrate. I often tell kids when I visit elementary schools that writing is just like illustrating, but I'm using different tools. When I'm illustrating, I'm using my Cintiq. I'm using pens and pencils and paintbrushes and various kinds of paper to form a picture. But when I'm writing a story, I'm also painting a picture, but I'm using words and I'm using adjectives and I'm using a story arc and I'm using, other types of visual tools. And, I love both. And the challenge, I would say, is always the same with both in that, because I focus in on telling historical stories, it's like, I have to do a lot of research. And it's like putting together a puzzle. And I have all of these various puzzle pieces that I find as I do my research all over the internet and into books. And so the challenge is in then putting all of these facts into the life of the person that I'm writing about, and then which one of these facts am I not going to include into the story. So all of that becomes a challenge, but figuring out that challenge and puzzling all of that out and then telling the story, I love a good challenge. And there's not a whole lot about my job that I don't like. I often, when I visit elementary schools, tell kids that I consider myself to be one of the luckiest people in the world because I get to get up every day and use the talents that I was born with to earn an income, to pay the bills in the house. And so, I love my work.
So I've got one from Kathy Curry. It kind of goes along with that. So digging a little deeper here. If you can do this, what is your favorite book you have written and illustrated?
Well, I don't have a favorite book. My books are like my offspring. So I like which one of my offspring am I going to choose as my favorite? All of these books have special meaning for me in some way. I would say that It Just Happened is my favorite book because it's the first book that I had published as an author. It was illustrated by someone else. I would say that The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton is my favorite book because it is the first book that I wrote and illustrated, and it won the Ezra Jack Keats New Writers Award. I would say that Lonnie Johnson's Super Soaking Stream of Inventions is my favorite book because it's the one that's made the most money. So all of my books have special meaning for me, so it would be very difficult for me to pick a favorite.
I think that's fair. So many different times, that's for sure. So Holly Bell, have you written a book about someone like you who's afraid to speak up in white society?
Have I written a book about someone like me? I would say that would be the book that I'm currently researching and writing right now. And it happens to be it's going to be a graphic novel memoir. And I don't want to give away too much about what that is going to be about. But when I was a kid, I was very shy, and so I didn't talk a whole lot. And it's going to be all about how I was able to overcome some of the challenges that I had going on at home. And not only that, some of the challenges that I had going on at home, but some of the challenges that I had as well as I was bused to a white school where I dealt with some of the racism at the white school. And it's all about a shy kid who learned to find his voice. A shy kid who didn't like to read, but somehow became an author and an illustrator. And right now I've recorded just dozens of hours interviewing my mom and my brothers and some of my neighbors who I grew up with. And I would say that that's going to be the story that's closest to who I am as a person. Well, obviously because I'm writing about myself.
Absolutely. And that's that's a pretty good segue into the next question. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Brown Bookshelf blog and the importance that you have in trying to spread those voices and get those voices out there. Just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Brown Bookshelf was the idea of a local to Austin author, Varian Johnson, and Paula Chase Hyman, who are both young adult authors, who came up with the idea for the Brown Bookshelf I think it was about 12 years ago. They both had books that were going to soon publish, and they were in some type of an online forum, and they were having a conversation about, my book is going to publish, and oftentimes our books go under the radar of the publishing industry, and they were voicing their frustration, and what can we do to not only highlight our own voices, but to highlight the voices of other African-American creators. And so they came up with the idea of the Brown Bookshelf, which would be a blog where we would do just that. We would highlight African-American authors and illustrators through reviews, through, our flagship program, which is called 28 Days Later, which is a celebration that we host during Black History Month. Every day during Black History Month, we highlight an African-American creator, an author or an illustrator, and their works. And the whole idea is just to, champion one another. I often say, no one is going to love you more than yourself. And that's pretty much what we are doing. We are loving other African-American book creators, because who else is going to do it if we don't?
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's so important and just so beneficial, the opportunities you've had and being able to give back and being able to help others, project and get it out there. That's awesome. That's awesome. We got a question here from Tanya Scott. So hello from Carter Lake Library on Joint Base Lewis McCord. Any interest in creating, any interest in creating historical graphic novels? Your style would be a great way to introduce younger readers to the graphic novel format.
I am just now experimenting with the graphic novel genre, and I'm discovering how much I love it. So I most definitely would be open to telling a story in graphic novel, telling a historical story in graphic novel format. Again, it's not something that I've experimented with yet, but I'm totally open to new things. So most definitely.
Very neat. Very neat. And one quick one here from Erica Flory. What were your favorite books from your childhood? Picture books, chapter, and or nonfiction?
I've always loved nonfiction. Again, when I was a kid, I wasn't a big reader, but my dad worked for Meredith Publishing Company, and they published the Better Homes and Gardens Family Illustrated Medical Encyclopedia, which was filled with things like bloody stomach ulcers and pussy toe sores and everything that you might think is gross, but this book was highly illustrated, and I loved reading this book, which probably accounts for the hypochondria that I suffer with today. But I loved that book because it was, illustrated. It was real stuff. And I think that because I read nonfiction as a kid, because I also loved the Funk and Wagnalls illustrated student encyclopedias. Again, small bits of text, highly illustrated with illustrations and photographs. And I think that because I read nonfiction as a kid, dictionaries and encyclopedias like that put me on the path of telling all of these stories as an adult. So I've always loved knowing that what I read was true. A fiction story comes out and everyone's talking about it, and I'll get excited about reading it. Then I'll go out and purchase it, and then I'm thinking, but it didn't really happen for real. It's all made up. And then I just love knowing that the story that exists actually happened. But that's just my personal taste.
Absolutely. Let's see. I've got there's one here. So focusing on, Black History Month and talking about displays, and we're getting ready. We want to make sure that we celebrate it properly, that we are expressing different experiences. Tell me just a little bit about some advice from you, really, on how, African American children, how through your work and the importance of honoring that history through making sure that Black children can see themselves through books, almost, mirrors, if you will, but also at the same time allowing it to be a window, for others to see into the culture, to see into the experiences that the African American community has had.
So I think the best advice that I could give you about Black History Month and the Black History Month, the displays and the conversations that happen during Black History Month is that you not limit the conversation to February. Black history is something that needs to be celebrated throughout the year. I feel like oftentimes we kind of compartmentalize it. It's like February is Black History Month, and you have Women's History Month, and you have Native American History Month, and then we have, but diversity is something that needs to be celebrated and talked about, and in your library and in your classroom year around, so that these books most definitely need to serve as windows to, I think about white children, or maybe a librarian who, has a very homogenous, library, mostly white kids. They need to see books that feature people who look like themselves, so that they can know that the world is made up of more people who are, who are unlike them. I think that when kids grow up in an environment where they only see themselves in books, they only see themselves, on television, it gives them a distorted sense of who they are. And then we end up with situations like we had going on in the Capitol last week. I think that it is important that that children have books that feature, that serve as mirror books where they can see themselves and learn about their past and be able to feel proud about where they came from. Again, I think about when I was a kid and I never saw myself in a book, or rarely saw myself in a book. And so therefore I grew up feeling shy and embarrassed about my own history. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s and I found voices like Richard Wright's Black Boy that featured a character that looks like me, that I finally became a reader. And I think that had there been more books like that spread out throughout the year, not only during Black History Month, I would have become a reader much younger.
I think that there's so many that I know growing up, I identify with that very much so. Individuals that we've spoken to, different comments that we've gotten from different books, yours specifically, and how important it is and how life-changing it is when you pick up a book on the shelf and you're not used to that, or more so, which is amazing, that's becoming more of the norm. And while there's still so far to go, when you can see yourself on that title when you're in the third grade, and understand that that's normal, that there are stories like what you experience. It's not so hidden, and it helps you have a voice. So that struck a chord with me for sure. So thank you.
And most definitely throughout the year, you don't. When Black history is only during the month of February, I remember, as a kid at an all-white school, the only Black kid at a mostly white school, and the subject of Black History Month came up. Sometimes I would want to curl up in a ball because my history was not something that was talked about throughout the year. It was relegated to just that one month, and then it was always on the topic of slavery. And so, Black history needs to be something that's celebrated year-round, and it needs to include a diversity of African-American stories and not just, slavery and civil rights.
Absolutely. There's one from Aaron Joshua that's in here. Do you have any untold stories that you're just dying to write about?
Untold stories that I'm just dying to write about. Actually, I have a computer file filled with all of those ideas that librarians and author buddies and the kids when I visit elementary schools have given me to possibly write about. And those stories haven't come to life for various reasons. Oftentimes, I'll do the research on a story, and while I have that one great thing that this person has done that maybe that they're known for, I'll discover that there's not enough research or there's not enough, out there that I can tell a complete story. So there's many reasons why I don't take these stories to completion, but I'm not sure if I'm going to give that away. Give the ones that I really am inspired to actually put on paper. I'm going to give those away today, but just know that I have, dozens and dozens of ideas tucked away that may or may not come to fruition.
All right. Well, keep us on our toes, edge of the seat. That's great. That's awesome.
But again, I do like to focus on those untold stories. I do remember when I was in elementary school, when Black history came up again, in addition to slavery, it was, Martin Luther King, and it was Rosa Parks, and it was Martin Luther King, and it was Rosa Parks, and then very rarely did it veer away from that. And so I am not likely to tell a story about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, although I love their stories, because I think that it's important to introduce children to a variety and to new historical figures that maybe they're not familiar with.
Yeah, and that I'll tell you, that actually leads right into the next question. So we're looking very specifically at William Steele and his freedom stories. The father of the Underground Railroad, and I would love it if you would just kind of talk to us a little bit about that book, what you're working on there, and I might have heard maybe you might even read a little bit from it. So I thought
certainly.
Yeah.
All right. So let me see. Where's the book here? So one of my newest books is William Steele and His Freedom Stories, the father of the Underground Railroad. And it is the story of a Black abolitionist, a man who helped hundreds of freedom seekers escape north into Canada on the Underground Railroad. And I wrote the book. I was inspired to write the book because of my mom. I have one of those moms who's always trying to give me ideas about what I should write about. So one day she sends me a copy of this book. Okay, she knows that I like these kind of books. She knows that I like the Family Illustrated Medical Encyclopedia. So she knows I like these types of books. This is the Biographical Dictionary of Black Americans. And this is a book that she found at a garage sale someplace. And so I opened up the book and I just started sketching some of the figures inside one Black History Month. And I decided to sketch some of the pictures of the people that I found inside the book. And I posted the pictures on some of my social networks and made them available as a free download. And then one day I came across the image of William Steele. He was known as the father of the Underground Railroad, who was an activist in his day, a civil rights activist, who became one of the richest Black men of his time for a coal yard and an ice yard business that he ran. This was a man who helped hundreds of enslaved people escape north on the Underground Railroad. This was a man who funded several of Harriet Tubman's rescues into the South. How come I had never heard of this man? I became so inspired again that I stopped sketching and I started writing. And I will share with you a short reading. I'm going to begin by sharing with you, these are the end papers for the book. This time last year when I was at ALA, my editor and I, we went to the Historical Society and they had set up one of William Steele's journals. And I discovered this particular page, which shows December 29th of 1854 was the night that Harriet Tubman passed through William Steele's line of the Underground Railroad. And I knew that that had to become the end papers for the book. So not only can the students read the stories, but they can actually see some of the primary sources that I've used in the book. The story begins at a time when the United States was split in two. In the North, Black people were free. In the South, they were enslaved by whites. Slavery was a nightmare, back-breaking work under a scorching sun, threats of a lashing or worse. There was no pay. Children were separated from their mamas and papas, brothers and sisters, sold away at auction, never to be seen again. Sometime during the 1700s, Levin and Sidney Steele were held captive on a Maryland farm, forced to work. Their 4 children were too. The family yearned to live free. I will die before I submit to the yoke, Levin told the man who enslaved him. The two came to an agreement. Levin was allowed to work over hours, actually receiving a small income. With the money he earned, Levin purchased his freedom, but freedom wasn't always fair, especially to Black people. Could a free Black man remain in the South? Levin must have wondered. Might he be enslaved again? No chancing that. Levin bid his family a goodbye with a plan to return to rescue them later. In a blink, he bolted north. Sidney wasn't so fortunate. There was no opportunity for her or the children to purchase their freedom. They remained behind, still enslaved, a separation Sidney could not endure. Torn and tormented, she whispered a parting prayer for her 2 boys, who were big enough and strong enough to fend for themselves. Then she escaped with her 2 girls. Sidney reunited with her husband in the Pine Woods near Washington Township, New Jersey. Now they were together, free as the wind. They changed their last name from Steele to throw slave catchers off. Their new life was good, but living ached like an open sore. Levin and Sidney longed for the 2 sons they had left behind. Over the years, the family grew. Now there were 15 children, 15 mouths to feed. Oh, how they struggled. Money was tight, food was scarce, shoes, if any, were hand-me-down. In 1821, the youngest child was born. Sunlit eyes, mahogany skin, they named him William. He grew quick as a weed. 8 years later, a neighbor was attacked late one night. The man had once been enslaved in the South. He had escaped and found peace in the pines. Slave catchers tracked the man down. They rushed at him, cuffed his arms, beat him badly. Thankfully, the man escaped again, but he needed help, and soon. The greedy men were still on the prowl. The neighbors, they called on William. The young boy knew every nick and cranny of those woods. William led the man to safety, some 20 miles away. That day began the life of young William Steele helping others. He would go on to later help enslaved people who were trying to escape from the South, to escape farther north into Canada on the Underground Railroad system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. I got a chance to read through the book and read through that story just a couple of times, and I can just tell you, just like you said, like just some of the ones that aren't out there in front, aren't talked about all the time, and seeing how powerful his story was, seeing all the things that he'd done, and someone that I never even heard about until I saw your book. So just thank you so much for finding that and taking that on to research those pieces of information and write those types of stories. It's so important. It's so important. There's a question on here. I thought that this would be a good time for it. Have you considered and thought about writing books or addressing things like the Black Lives Matter movement and things that are going on currently in the country, like stories or things like that you'd want to write about and tell?
I actually created in comic form a a story like that for a collection that's going to publish next year with Just Us Books and Crown, called Recognize, which is edited by Cheryl Hudson and Wade Hudson. And yes, it is all about my experience of going through the pandemic and also some of the uprisings of last summer. And I won't give away the story, but I explored my own experiences with some of the current social justice issues. And I would, most definitely be open to addressing that in picture book form as well. It's not something that I've much thought about or pursued yet, but I most definitely, I believe in keeping my doors open and, fleshing out the ideas as they come to me. So most definitely.
Right. And Andrea Foote, I'm asking how or who is your favorite author, if you can narrow that down?
Who is my favorite author? That's a tough one. I would say, though, that still to this day is Richard Wright. Again, I wasn't a reader. And then when I started working for the Perfection Learning Corporation in Des Moines, there was an unfinished area upstairs that was served as the library. And I would go up there and take breaks. And one day I discovered on the shelf the words Black Boy. And at first I was offended, because when I was in school, Black Boy, those were fighting words. So I went over and I picked that book up and I discovered a character who looked like me, who shared a culture, who shared my culture. And that day I became a reader. Black Boy led me to then go on to read Native Son. And I've read all of Richard Wright's books. Last summer, many years later, I went back and I listened to Black Boy as an audiobook, and I fell in love with Richard Wright's works again. So Richard Wright, I would say, is my all-time favorite author.
Thank you.
And you may have been looking for someone more currently, and I'm a little bit shy about putting the name out there, but there's so many wonderful writers out there now that I would be reluctant to name just one of them.
Well, that's very fair. That's very fair. So Sue Young asked, has your writing voice changed over the years as you've published more books?
I don't know that my writing voice has changed much, but I have been, I'm a lot more open now to experimenting with the different ways of writing. So with It Just Happened, that was your typical way of, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. I don't know the correct writing lingo for that. But with the last few books that I've written, I've experimented with prose and, so just I'm more open to different ways of storytelling today. I never considered myself a poet before, but using prose to tell William Steele's story allowed me to communicate a very complicated story. A story that deals with the topic of slavery, a story that deals with the topic of the Underground Railroad system and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and William Steele's works and the many stories that he wrote. And that's a lot of stuff to fit into a 32-page picture book. And I began writing that story in my typical paragraph by paragraph way of telling a story. But what I discovered is that poetry and verse offers me a certain economy, and allowed me to pack a whole lot of information into 32 pages. So just, the more that I write, the more that I learn about writing and the more that I'm open to trying different things.
Thank you. Jennifer asked, I'm interested in picture books for older students, middle school and up. Which books do you promote for the older readers? I also love Whoosh and Carter Reads the Newspaper, by the way.
I think that any one of my books are appropriate for young readers as well as older readers. And I think I encourage you to use picture books with older readers. And I would say even well into high school as well. When I was in high school, I don't remember. For one thing, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in the library, but I don't remember there being picture books in the library. But picture books would have been something that would have appealed to me, because first and foremost, because of the artwork. So yeah, I commend you if you're using picture books for older readers. But yeah, I think that my books are especially appropriate for the older reader because they do deal with more challenging subject matter. And while I don't shy away from telling my readers the truth, there are going to be some people who are uncomfortable with younger readers and, on certain topics. But I think that my books are appropriate for all ages.
I agree. Well, this one's very, very telling. I'd love to get your opinion, your thoughts on this. Kelly, as a white librarian at a largely Black middle school, I am passionate about offering diverse materials. I have trouble with the Black students putting their trust in me to help them. Do you have any tips that I can use to connect with these students? I would say that school visits for me have been, school author visits have been a wonderful way to not only introduce the subject matter of my books, but to introduce the idea that Black authors are writing and illustrating books. I remember at one particular school visit where where I visited, the kids were so excited to have an author there for their author visit day. And one of the little girls walks up to me and she says, "I didn't know that authors could be Black," and she wasn't trying to be offensive. It's just maybe in her library, the librarian maybe didn't have a whole lot of books that featured African-American authors and illustrators, and they never had a Black author come visit the school. So, I think that is important. That is important. I also think that it's important for students to be able to read the story and be able to turn to the jacket flap and see that an African-American person wrote this book, so that they can also dream of growing up to become an author and an illustrator. I think just by having the books in your library and by inviting a diversity of authors and illustrators to the library, that right there is going to help garner trust between you and your Black student. If your library features books that are mostly white characters, have white authors come in and speak, then that's not going to do a whole lot for creating a lot of trust between you and the students. So I would say that that's the best advice that I can get. And I'm sure you've seen this, there's kids that you've probably got notes from, teachers and educators that you've heard from, and Holly Bell kind of this lines up perfectly with the next question. Talk a little bit about your path to publishing. What advice would you give a young reader or someone interested in becoming an illustrator? How did you find your first publisher? Do you have any suggestions or encouraging young writers towards publishing? So just I know that was a lot in one piece, but what type of advice would you have to those young readers that are interested in that, and talk a little bit about your path towards publishing?
So this advice is going to be very boring, I'm sure, but it is the best advice that I can give you because it was the advice that had been given to me throughout early on in my career. And it's this simple: if you are aspiring to become an author, you have to write, and you have to write frequently. I like to tell people to write every day, but sometimes that's not possible. But the more that you do something, the more that you polish your skills, the better you're going to get at that skill. And if you are aspiring to become an illustrator, get yourself a sketch pad or an iPad or an iPhone or just a napkin and draw every day. You might say, I can't draw hands. Hands are hard to draw. But if you draw a hand every day, it's going to become much easier. And I remember when I was trying to get into publishing and I was getting a lot of rejection, I reached out to one of my favorite illustrators, Brian Pinckney. And I asked him, "Brian, how come I'm not able to get published? Can you give me some advice about how to get published?" I had tried all of these various styles and was receiving a lot of rejection. And Brian told me to not give up on my style, not to give up on who I am, to continue to do what I love to do in the style that I love to do it, and wait for that right editor who would eventually come along and offer me a manuscript. And it just so happened that that right editor for me was Andrea Pinkney. And so to this day, and I should probably back up a little bit, because when I first got into publishing, which was in the late 80s, I guess, most of the illustrations in children's books for African Americans they were very realistic and portraiture. Where with my styles, you can see I have a lot of different styles. I kind of like to do caricature and cartoon and stylized, and I don't really like to do portraiture. But again, Brian told me to do what I like to do, and eventually an editor would come along, and now, 20, 30 years later, I'm still doing it, and I'm doing it the way, I'm creating artwork that speaks to my heart. I'm creating the kind of artwork that I like to do. So I would say to remain consistent to who you are. And so that's the best advice that I can give to my young artists. That was kind of a long, babbling answer to the question. But what I was trying to say basically is to practice, to come up with a style that works for you, that makes you happy as an artist, and stick to that style.
Thank you. So, Kathy Curry, Don, if you don't mind, fill in this blank. Passion, purpose, blank.
Passion, purpose, and a lot of hard work. You can have passion and you can have purpose, but if you don't, like Jane Yolen would say, sit your butt in the chair and do the work, it's not going to happen. So every day I get up and I take my passion and my purpose and I sit down at this computer and I plug away at the illustrations, or I'm at my other computer and I'm writing. And even though some days it can be very frustrating, because another part of the process is the revision process. And that's where your editor says, it's not quite working and you need to redo this or that aspect of the work. And you get frustrated. But you don't give up. You sit back and you continue to revise and polish your work. And remember that that's just part of the process.
Thank you. So Alan Bailey, William Steele was an extraordinary person. I'm sure a lot of research went into your book. Please tell us just a little bit about your research process for that book.
Yes. So with almost all of my books, and I know you're gonna like bristle for a second there, but I almost always do some cursory research on Wikipedia. Okay, and often when I visit elementary schools, I tell kids, don't do your research on Wikipedia. But my research doesn't stop there. I look down at the source material, and the source material led me to a website at Temple University where they have a complete section on William Steele, which then led me to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it led me to a librarian at Temple University. I reached out to that librarian because as the illustrator, I want to know what things looked like. So I would tell the librarian, I'm doing a story about William Steele. I want to know what Pennsylvania looked like in the 1850s. And she gave me reading materials where I could, that I could use as reference material, find out what things looked like. But then in addition, I made a trip to Philly, and I visited the Johnson House, which once served as an Underground Railroad stop. It was a meeting place. It was actually a meeting place where William Steele actually held some of his meetings. And I took photographs, and I used those photographs as reference for the book. And then again, I went to the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and I went through reams and reams of microfiche. William Steele was not only a storyteller, but he documented everything. And I found many of those documents there on microfiche. But I was able to pour all of that research into the visuals for the story. Glad that you're here, Alan.
Thank you. Don, this one kind of dives in a little deeper. Holly Bell, when you write about history, Many people's lives have traumatic events in them. How do you decide to write about this in your books for young readers? Telling the truth, but not scaring them.
Well, a couple of different ways. So in terms of how do I tell the truth in a story visually without scaring my young readers, and oftentimes for me, it's the style that I choose. I could choose to tell a story, for instance, The Amazing Age of John Roy Lynch, which deals with the topic of slavery, but it also deals with the many horrors of Reconstruction. This book features a church burning. It features a near lynching, and I felt like had I illustrated that book in a very realistic style, that would have been way too scary for young readers. So I tend to choose a style that is a bit more soft, is a bit more whimsical, is probably not the right word to use, but whimsical. It just kind of softens the subject matter. And I don't shy away from telling children the truth in my words. African-American children lived through these horrors years ago, so children today can learn from what they went through many years ago and use those stories as a guide for navigating some of the challenges that they're going to face with social justice issues into the future. So I don't shy away from telling my young readers the truth.
Thank you. I think that there is something about understanding your history, understanding your path, and how you can utilize that to make the future better. And I guess, kind of hiding that from them doesn't accomplish that.
I remember one time I was at a book festival and I was getting ready. I think I may have been reading Poet. And I was on the page where I was talking about young George Moses Horton being enslaved, and young father got up and grabbed his daughter and immediately left. And I don't know that they were leaving because of my story, but I kind of felt like he just didn't want to have to deal with the topic of slavery at a book festival. But I just thought, it's an important story, and it's an important story where her child could have learned about an inspirational historical figure who dealt with some of the adversities from the past. And so, I'm very honest with my readers.
So there's got to be, with the research that you do and everything that you've got going on, there's got to be, your mind's got to be running a mile a minute, right? So with the busyness that you have, Kathy Curran thought this was a good one. How do you rest your mind in order to continue to be creative?
How do I rest my mind? Well, again, I'm very much a physical fitness person. So before the COVID, I was at the gym every day lifting weights. And now that we're in the COVID, I still swim. I'm at the pool 3 times a week. I walk, 2 to 3 miles a day. And oftentimes I'm in this pool and I'm doing my laps and I'm puzzling out the plot of a particular story. And so physical fitness and staying in shape is the way that kind of helps me it just kind of helps me to keep my head on straight when I'm dealing with difficult subject matter.
And this kind of probably leans into it. This was a question a little earlier. I wanted to wait for the right time to ask it, but is that why Cindy Brewer asked, why'd you want to get into bodybuilding? Was that part of it, or kind of tell us a little bit about where that?
So I wanted to get into bodybuilding because when I was a kid, I was skinny, and my mom called me Skinny Minnie, and my friends made fun of my skinny legs, and so I just wanted to grow up and look like the Incredible Hulk. Okay, so that didn't happen, obviously, but my younger brother Brian got involved in natural bodybuilding in his mid-20s, and he became the first African American to win Mr. Iowa. And if you've ever been to a bodybuilding competition, it is the weirdest thing, with all of the wives and husbands cheering on the guys in their bodybuilding trunks on stage. But I couldn't wait to get on stage and do that myself. And when I won that trophy that night, it was just like the best thing that ever happened to me. And so I wanted to figure out a way to put that into a story. So I guess I was I wanted to get involved in bodybuilding because I just wanted to feel healthier. Yeah.
That's great. And then kind of along with the illustrations, do you enjoy painting as well? So will your illustrations be put to canvas or in an art gallery?
So, I have not touched real paint in about maybe 6 years. You can't see it from there, but I have a 32-inch Cintiq, which I describe to young children as just like a great big iPad. So I pretty much work digitally today, but I began, and the majority of my career, I painted over there on my easel. But, I've always wanted to be a computer artist, even from high school. I remember when I graduated from high school, someone asked me how I would use my art. And I said, I'm going to be a computer artist. And I said that not because there was such thing as computer art at that time. I just think it sounded kind of exotic and something that I would want to do. And little did I know at that time that 20 years later, everyone would be computer artists if you're going to be in the commercial arts. I keep telling myself that one day I'm going to pull out my easel and my oil paints and I'm going to go back to the canvas. But then I look at my tight deadlines and I'm back over here on my Cintiq. I can illustrate a book now in about 2.5 months once I get approval to do the illustrations in about 2.5 months, and I can do it faster and cleaner, and I can make revisions much easier than if I were illustrating it in natural media.
Thank you. So I know we have time for just a few more questions. But one to ask you, Dory asked, being a non-reader when you were younger, what would you tell students who are non-readers and inspire them to read more?
To inspire a young reader, I just think that young readers can discover new books by trying new books. I don't know that I know the answer to that question other than to try. You just like with food or anything else, you try different things, different genres, different historical figures. Maybe you don't like reading history stories. Then what you'll want to do is read the stories. Like, for instance, with my son, I was constantly feeding my son, who was a non-reader, I was feeding him Black history stories because I kind of felt like that's what I needed when I was a kid. So here's all the Black history stories I could feed him. And it wasn't until he was about 4th grade when he discovered that he loved the series about the hamster. Okay. He loved reading about hamsters, and that's eventually what made him a reader. So I think that, you want to go to your library every day and be open to trying different things. Try graphic novels, try fiction, try historical fiction until one day you discover that story that really speaks to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Jennifer asked, you said earlier that there is more to Black history than just slavery and civil rights movement. What other part of history will you be or have you addressed in your writing?
What I would love to experiment with at some point in my career, and I'm not there yet, is I would love to experiment with African history before slavery. A lot of African history was told, oratory. And so a lot of that history was lost during the slave trade. And oftentimes we tell our kids that, our African-American kids, that you come from royalty, you come from kings and queens. But I want to be able to put a book into a child's hand that tells and illustrates that as well. So I would love to eventually be able to skip past African American history in this country and go to history in Africa. Because our history goes back to the beginning of time.
So one more. That's what stories can do. Protest injustice, soothe, teach, inspire, connect. Stories save lives. What does that mean to you? That note, I just noticed it several times. Why? Why was that emphasis so important? What does that note mean to you? Why is that so prominent in the story?
Well, because, quite honestly, writing the William Steele story took many years. And it wasn't until I completely finished that story and revised it a gazillion times and was sending the story off to my editor that I looked at that last page and I just kind of felt like something was missing. And that's what came to me. I wanted to communicate to my reader the importance of story and how story affects all of us and how stories can save lives and the importance of preserving these stories. And so I put that on the last page of the very last revision, but then it kind of fell off because then we got to that paragraph, but that theme wasn't worked throughout the book. So I went back through and wove that theme of storytelling and preserving stories throughout the book because I thought that was something important. Again, I was telling you about how I'm working on a graphic novel memoir right now. So I've been interviewing my mom and my brothers and neighbors to be sure that what I remember is in alignment with what we experienced, what I experienced with them. But I wish that I would have interviewed my grandfather and my grandmother before they passed. Those are stories that are going to be lost to history. So just an example of the importance of the kids knowing their history and interviewing their grandparents. When I go to a doctor, the first thing they want to know is the history of my grandparents' health. Another example of knowing your history, but in a very different way. Again, another very long, rambly answer, but an important one, I think.
Absolutely. Right. Well,
yeah, I'll just pop on here again. I'm the lucky one who just gets to say thank you and goodbye to you guys both. But that was just a wonderful conversation. Dawn, if you could see all the wonderful things coming in from our viewers, thanking you for your time and for your powerful message, you would be as feeling as heart-filled as I do, and we'll share them with you. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and Dawn, especially thank you for joining us. And I also wanted to put in a plug because we've had a few people ask us in the Q&A about Dawn doing school visits, and I've talked to his publicist, and yes, he does. And you can find out information about his school visits on his website, dontate.com. So thank you again to both of you. We loved it so much, and we can't wait to work with you again, Dawn.
Thank you. It was such an honor to be here. Thank you for your support again, Junior Library Guild, and everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.